Today, I have the tremendous pleasure to be interviewing Professor Dimitris Papanikolaou, Associate Professor of Modern Greek Studies at the University of Oxford. Dimitris is a well-published author, and most recently, his latest book, hot off the press, is a book that will shake up a few established opinions. It's called The Greek Weird Wave, a cinema of biopolitics. And as much as I would like to ask Dimitris questions about this book, today we'll focus on something different. Dimitris will take us back to the Greek service, the BBC Greek service that was at some point in time, between 1939 and 2005 to be precise, housed at King's College, now King's College, Bush House. And so I'll start by asking Dimitris some questions about that Hellenic υπηρεσία at Bush House before it joined King's College, because the experience is very personal for him. Dimitris, thank you for doing this, and tell us a little bit first about the location, the atmosphere, and how you yourself became affiliated with the BBC Greek service.
Thank you, Gonda. Thank you, Gonda, for this invitation. I'm very happy to talk in this context, in this frame, for the BBC World Service and what it was for me. I was never a key player. I was never one of those people who gave their lives to the BBC Greek service, and there were many and very inspiring people. Thus, I have never talked about this experience I had. I worked at the BBC, in the BBC World Service, in the Greek section, from 1999 to 2003. I was at the time doing my PhD at UCL, the other University of London, as we used to say at the time. And what I wanted to share with you today, and this is the reason I'm doing it, even though I'm sure there must be so many other people who can talk about the Greek service of the BBC and the World Service, is to share this experience of being a student and also part of a service in the Bush House. I find it such a brilliant thing that now a university is housed in the Bush House, and I will try to explain why. So this is the reason I accepted this invitation. I will try not to talk so much about my role, because it was a very minor role in that amazing history that the Greek service of the BBC World has been. Anyway, as you said, the BBC Greek service, for us Greek, it was always a huge thing. It's been a service that's been related to a number of historical events and periods. It was very popular with Greeks, especially in periods of turmoil, in periods during wars, during the occupation, then most importantly during the 7-year dictatorship from 1974. I remember growing up and our parents always referring to the role of the BBC during that period. Authors or songwriters I studied actually referred to that in their work. It was not only common knowledge, part of folklore, what the BBC World Service had been. So imagine growing up in Greece and listening to all of that. Once you get to London, the first thing you wanted to do, if you were somehow that inclined, if you liked journalism, was to get into the Bush House. So Bush House was like this mythical. I remember the very first day I crossed the entrance to sit exams. At the time there was this kind of exams, and I had to pass them twice. It was quite common as a student to try to get a job at the BBC. I remember how elated I was when I got the job. The BBC Greek service was at the time, once you would come in from the north entrance, you'd have to go out to the alley. Then it was on the left, on the second floor, if I'm not wrong. And it had been there for decades. So people had their offices. These were offices with memory. So you would see piles of tapes, of old recordings. Journalists had their own personal material there, objects, and it was a place full of history, full of stories as well. And I haven't been now. I hope I will do so immediately after the COVID thing. But if only that kind of memory could survive somehow. It's not only that the Bush House was full of this kind of small services that had memories themselves, because each and every small national service or language service rather had similar impact in the countries they transmitted. It still happens in the BBC. It was just that with Bush House, it was an old building. People had been there for decades, and there were the stories of the building as well as the stories of the impact of each service in the countries that they were broadcasting. So I remember going back to that second floor. Eventually it moved in the last years. It was on the other side, on the 5th floor, I believe. And so the building itself was already part of the experience that eventually was becoming more and more important once you got to know how the BBC was working. It was at the time so different to the kind of other journalist experience that one would have had, like in countries like Greece. It was a real school. So in that sense, for me, it actually, I see that kind of history of the Bush House as not that interrupted with King's College moving in now. For me, it was an educational institution, even when I was working there. And I'm happy that then another educational institution has taken on the building.
Thank you. May I also ask you to reflect on there's the professional side of things, what you see as your very formative educational experience. But knowing you, I'm also sure that there was a social aspect to the proximity, the hanging out together in the courtyard. I've heard legendary words about a cafe in the basement. So can you tell us a little bit how diplomacy did its work and personal relationships did its work in addition to the working hours, which I'm sure your expertise there and your eye for it can inform us brilliantly here.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm always talking from my own very specific personal experience here. So there are 3 points I want to make. With the last being the educational, there's still to talk about the educational part of it. But before that, yes, the social aspect, suddenly you had all those services from people from different countries, all of them extremely interesting people, of course, with very interesting backgrounds, but also other projects. I remember it was the first time I saw so many journalists together, who all of them were doing also other things. There were people who were working part-time because they were doing PhDs, as I was doing. There were people who were at another level in their career, but they were still writing books, translating. They would produce stuff. I had a colleague who was an artist and continued doing that even after her retirement. So it was that kind of community that was very interesting. Now, the services normally were 24-hour services. People had night shifts, also because services were broadcasting in other countries which had a different time, which already had time difference. So, for instance, in the case of the Greek service, in order to broadcast the 6 o'clock morning news, you had to be there from midnight British time. because you would have to broadcast at 4 and so on. So I remember those long nights and the way to cross from the one part of the building to the other side. Often the studios would be on the other side. So the best way to cross was through the canteen, which was in the basement. It was really a crossing space in many ways. I mean, of course, we would cross. Sometimes you would take a coffee on the way to the studio, on the way back. You would meet other people. By doing that, often you would know whom you would meet because, depending on the shifts and all that. So I remember that kind of, I don't know what is now. Is it still a cafe in the basement?
It's a restaurant, actually. I'll take you there. Once we are free again, we need to go and visit.
It was similar there. For me, it was the cheapest coffee in London, of course, because it was kind of much cheaper than I would buy in my university. And but I remember that kind of crossing. You had to cross from one part to the other, but at the same time, you would somehow kind of connect differently to people and to the whole different kind of stories. I have also to say that the BBC, and that's the second point I'm making, the BBC world, this is still the case. But at the time, with, of course, no internet, when I joined, still internet was in its infancy, and certainly we didn't have that kind of access to information the same way. The BBC World was a place of constant reflection. So there was information coming in, of course, from the central BBC, information that got translated in the various services, but the services had their own original production as well. However, also the way that the services would connect, sometimes work together, was a constant reflective approach to those news that were coming from the central BBC service. And for me, that was at the time, I remember, because it was close to interests I had in my own studies. I remember other colleagues who who were studying at the LSE, actually, who were studying journalism, and found the very atmosphere in the BBC, in the very way that news were somehow filtered in this very building. I'm not talking about the way that shows were produced, but the way that that multilingual, multi-ethnic group of people were filtering ideas and news was already very self-reflective and reflective of. So for somebody who had that kind of interest, it was an amazing place to be. A lot of ideas that eventually shaped my academic career, I must admit, were first perhaps framed there. And this also goes to the larger kind of the larger setting of the BBC, but it goes also to the very specific Greek service. So it was a place where ideas were constantly there and redeveloped. A lot of well-known journalists actually learned their trade there. Many others had a little bit of a passing, a short period that was formative, and many people, I speak here for the Greek service, I know this is the case for other services that were in the Bush House, used their time in the service to both fund their studies, but also, as I said, to learn a thing or two about self-reflection and how discourses work, how news work. So this comes to my third point. I said before that the BBC World was a educational space as well in many ways. For us it was, for me it was. I know so many other people who now have academic careers whom I knew from that period. It was also, interestingly, a very academic place because of its proximity to the two universities, LSE and King's College. I had colleagues who had opted for part-time courses at King's College. Actually, this is something you like. The King's College at the time handbooks, promotional material for courses. I don't know, listeners of this might not have, only people of a certain age remember those big booklets that universities used to publish at the time, because of course there was no way for potential students to get online and learn about the courses, so they would publish those front kind of books about the courses, the material, and these had also this big application file in the middle. That booklet you would find in the BBC a lot, in many. Why? Because many people would search for small degrees or part-time degrees or even full-time degrees to do on the side. And I did have colleagues who were doing degrees on the side or postgraduate degrees at King's. Why? Because it was just across the road, especially humanities fields and BAs, and sort of it was easy after a shift to go to a lecture. For that reason also, many services were close to the departments that sort of related to that language and culture at King's. The Greek service was quite close to the department of King's. We would go to if you could, you would just cross the road and go to lecture, a public lecture, a seminar, and then also you would have there a simple, a very accessible pool of specialists to interview every time you had something related. So there was a connection. I mean, now I know King's came closer to the Bush House, but when it was like across the road, it was close enough as well.
I like that you sketch out the history of an intellectual connection, and also some sort of an archival collection with archives of knowledge, distilled knowledge being produced in multi-ethnic environments on both sides of the Strand. And I kind of see the origins here of a phrase that you made famous, archive trouble. You point to the transition, the radical transition to new technologies and also to political developments, because you were there at the critical time of 9/11, 2001, to remember correctly. So you kind of, without necessarily realizing at the time, were there at a very critical juncture in which everything was thrown in some sort of a whirlwind. And I wonder if you can if you reflect with a certain nostalgia on that, whether any period in your life has been this intense, with so many formative strands of your later personality, academic and personal, coming together.
You know, yes, as you say, in my own academic work, I at one point coined this term archive trouble, which means the kind of embodied feeling, push to revisit one's history, one's a bigger relationship with history. And sometimes only when we decided to talk about this, I realized that the very first day I joined the BBC World Service in '99, my first job was to work a little bit on the archive of the BBC Greek service, those tapes that still were there. You know, I'm one of the last people, I suppose, in the service to have learned how to do editing on a tape. You know, this with a razor and all that. I suppose a year later, when was that? A couple of years later, that was already defunct. That was already old story, archaeology, media archaeology. But what is interesting, I want here to share the viewpoint of a student from a country in the semi-periphery of Europe who came to London and had a part-time job in the Bush House. You know, suddenly you were thrown in the heart of the empire. It's the guts as well in the empire. You know, that cafe there was like, and you would feel that precisely because you had access, you could have a self-reflective access to news agendas and discussions about news and policies and politics and international politics that you wouldn't necessarily easily have outside. It's slightly different now, but I want to share this viewpoint precisely because I didn't play any role or I never had like a huge job. So yes, a moment that, say, a national disaster, an earthquake in Greece happened, or a moment that when this international moment of 9/11 and then the war happened, that kind of secluded space of the Bush House, I'm not sure I can share it fully, but there is something. I will try to give it through affective language, but there was something there. We were all from different parts of the world, differently related to what was happening and impacted upon. And at the same time, talking the language of an empire, you know, and then a language of a country that was going to war. From so many different perspectives, viewpoints, and in the BBC world, I know this is true for the whole BBC, a lot of viewpoints can coincide and can be heard in the meeting, actually. So for me, it was eye-opening. I will never forget that moment, and also that feeling of entering the building, what this representing, like what kind of heart is it now beating here? And I remember very much, of course, the moment of 9/11 when suddenly all news items became one, and all service, all broadcasts, 25, 30, 35-minute broadcasts were like monothematic, one subject. And I remember the feeling I had those days. And I think it's amazing that we started this conversation from the building and from King's position now there in that building. If you want to talk about this thick history, perhaps one shouldn't focus so much on the big moments, you know, the big wars or the big interviews. It's the small stories that made it, but also the different layers of impact that the BBC World has had, especially outside Britain. Here you have an idea. The archive of the BBC World Service and the BBC World Service in Bush House, to focus on that, is not one that can be found only within the BBC. And it might be an archive of feelings, an archive of diverse memories that could be again hosted in the Bush House in different ways, though. The archive of the BBC World Service, for instance, also is in the memories of Greeks, in the various histories related with Greece and Cyprus in the way that the Greek service impacted on them, in diverse histories of people who worked there. It also might be housed in other archives. I'll tell you a story that has happened to me recently. I was at Princeton researching on something completely different on a grant. And somehow one thing brings another. And I found the archive of Nikos Stangos. Nikos Stangos was a famous poet, but also, perhaps more importantly, an editor and publisher in Britain who had made his career in Britain. He was Greek. Now, in his archive, I realized that he kept a very long correspondence with one of the producers in the BBC Greek service. I actually saw letters written during the shift about everything. About, as I said, everybody in the BBC had side projects. And also it was quite something. It was the only job I had seen where people would stay more in their place of work. Why? Because at the time, every time, the BBC World had better connection to the world before the internet. Once the internet started, we have better internet there. I had a better internet than what I had in the university. But before that, we had telephones. I mean, it was quite a thing to go and have a shift and afterwards call your mum in your own country. Sorry, BBC, but yes, people would call relatives. Or call friends or write to friends and then post the letters from the letterbox. That was I believe you have kept the letterboxes. That was great.
Yes.
It was an institution. You would write after the shift and then you would post immediately before you went. So I am at Princeton in the library, in the archive there, and I realize I'm in front of a long correspondence written in lengthy night shifts from that old colleague of mine, the late Yanis Karavidas, who also once taught at King's as well, and who had an interest for literature, was seeking out correspondence in the literary world related to Greece. And during those long letters, everything passes. Like you could see narrated a number of stories about the BBC, about people who had come over to give an interview, literary stories about Greece or about English letters. I remember even pinpointing one reference to myself working on the other desk one evening. So the thick archives of lives in the BBC World Service lie elsewhere. Perhaps they're diverse. They are expanded, and they are in places that perhaps is not very easy to think at the moment. But what a better idea than King's becoming a hub for research projects to reconstruct those unending, I think, histories and stories of the BBC World Service in the Bush House. The Greek service is a good place to start from. So Gonda, there's space there for work, and I hope that young people listening would go on to sort of reconstruct and these stories of the Greek and of the many other services that used to be in the Bush House.
Thank you, because we're working on that idea, and it's wonderful to have your full endorsement of it. And I like the thickness of the archive that you bring out so well. May I ask, during your time there, and given what kind of a vibrant environment it was, can you tell us of some colorful Greek characters that came through at an era that the artistic world, the Greek student movement, and various social movements were brewing? Do you remember any colorful characters coming through and what they brought to your experience there?
Well, unfortunately, I don't remember so many colorful characters, as it were. I do remember, though, people with great personalities working in the BBC. I remember great moments in the service, in other services. However, I have to say this. In every single country that where the BBC World had an impact and is still having, there are moments, big media events related to the BBC. Often they're also kind of legendary photographs, images. People have images of the BBC World Service that become almost a kind of imaginary construction. From a moment on. For the Greeks, there is a legendary photograph of poet Nobel laureate George Seferis speaking in the BBC with the big old microphone of the BBC. I believe there's also one of Maria Callas, and there must be others too. But the Seferis one is particularly well known. So I do remember a lot of people, politicians as well as many artists, who would pass by the service if they were in London, and would at some point ask whether they could have a photograph with this kind of old microphone. Of course, by the time there were no similar microphones in the studios, but the power of that image of the big Greek poets behind a old BBC style microphone was such that people wanted to reconstruct it. I remember this more than once this kind of pledge by someone to be, and I don't remember how we resolved it. I think we did something. We had some sort of BBC kind of microphone photograph, and more than once, and that was one of the most colorful moments I remember. I also remember as a very colorful moment calling home from the BBC. With,
I like the
my mom having just heard me on the radio.
right.
I don't know how this kind of affective memory that I know other people have can, because we wouldn't call so much home at the time, right? And everybody would have the same. So these are the colorful moments. Other people wanting to be photographed with the BBC microphone, and friends on the phone in other desks or in my desks back home after a shift.
I like how you're being asked to kind of help recreate the archive of the imaginary that people are already building about the BBC, and how it kind of self-perpetuated itself in the interaction of the Greeks then with the BBC. Well, Dimitri, I can't thank you enough.
There is a parallel with the Koraes chair. I don't know if you have still kept it, but in the old days, the library in King's, when it was basically on the Strand, in the main campus, in the main building, the library had the chair on the way into the library. You had an old chair that used to be apparently used to belong to the first holder of the Koraes chair, and it was called the Koraes chair. So you would see a chair, a wooden chair, talking about imaginary constructions there. I don't know where this chair is now. As another Greek poet says, it must, the poor thing must be somewhere. I don't know, but it's kind of to talk about how places construct their own imaginary.
Well, thank you. You gave me a mission there to go and look for the chair, and also you give.
I still remember when it was in the library, in the entrance to the library. I mean, it was a chair. It was the only academic chair that I had seen in my life, sort of non-allegorized, but sort of literalized as a chair in a library. So yeah, you have to find it again. Now that you're going finding stuff for the BBC World, perhaps you can put the two stories together, the story of the King's College building and the Bush House building. After all, they are stories that were intertwined throughout.
Absolutely. I want to thank you so much for giving us this very richly layered introduction to the Bush House and to its Greek history. And you give me every encouragement to bring this live to the Bush House, hopefully to the second floor one day, and do this for a live audience. So as soon as we're freed from lockdown, we have an additional mission to start working on. But for now, thank you so much for giving us the best possible introduction to a past world that still lives on in the Bush House and in its relation with kings. Thank you so much, Dimitri.